In the depths of New York's Lower East Side, a young immigrant named Salvatore Luciano rose from poverty to become the architect of the mafia's transformation into a business empire. Through cunning strategy and unrelenting ambition, he united fragmented criminal factions, manipulating alliances and orchestrating power plays that would reshape the criminal world. But his ascent wasn't without cost, as he betrayed allies and navigated deadly rivalries. With a vision of organized crime as a legitimate enterprise, Luciano's influence grew beyond the streets, touching industries, politics, and international trade. His legacy is not just that of a criminal mastermind, but of a man whose ambition transcended even the law itself. The world of organized crime is a labyrinth of power, betrayal, and secrecy, a dark undercurrent that runs through the veins of history, shaping not just cities but entire nations. We often hear whispers about the men who ruled this shadowy empire, yet their true influence remains largely shrouded in mystery. Beneath the well-polished surfaces of corporate skyscrapers and political institutions, these figures wove their webs of control, manipulating not only the criminal world but also the social and political systems that govern them. It's a legacy of power that reaches far beyond the streets, affecting everything from local economies to international relations, and it all began in the most unlikely of places, the poverty-stricken, immigrant-heavy neighborhoods of early 20th century New York City. This is the story of how one such man, a boy from the slums who would rise to unimaginable power, helped shape an empire that would echo through time and influence the very fabric of society. The world Luciano inhabited in his early years was one of grit and survival. Born in the heart of the Lower East Side, a melting pot where desperation and opportunity collided, he quickly learned that power was the only currency that mattered. In a city where millions of immigrants were trying to stake their claim, life was not handed to anyone, it was seized. From a young age, he learned that the American dream was often nothing more than a brutal myth, one that promised wealth and success but was often only attainable through sheer force or cunning. For those at the bottom of the social ladder, the streets themselves became both the battleground and the arena in which that dream could be either crushed or won. But it wasn't just the streets of New York that molded him, it was the world of crime that flourished there in the early 1900s. In these days, organized crime was not the high-tech, slick machine we imagine today. Instead, it was a chaotic, fragmented network of independent gangs, each fighting for dominance in their own territory. These gangs fought tooth and nail over control of the city's most lucrative illegal industries, bootlegging, gambling, and the vice that came with it. But even more importantly, these groups represented the extreme social divisions of the time. They were often fueled by ethnic and racial loyalties, a way to protect and preserve one's community from the ever-encroaching forces of the law. For men like Luciano, these gangs were not simply a means of making money, they were a way to rise above the crushing poverty of their neighborhoods. Through violence, intimidation, and cunning, they could carve out a name for themselves, and that's precisely what Luciano set out to do. Yet, for all the chaos that defined his early world, there was one undeniable truth. There was a certain kind of genius in Luciano's rise. He was not a simple thug or a brute, but a man who could read people, anticipate moves, and capitalize on the very weaknesses of those around him. Luciano saw that the fragmented underworld of New York could not survive as a disorganized entity. It needed someone who could unite the fractured groups, someone who understood that control wasn't just about brute force, it was about organization, strategy, and maintaining a delicate balance of power. And so, Luciano began to rise, quietly, strategically, always in the background, manipulating the players and positioning himself for the day when he would step into the spotlight. The key to his rise wasn't just his street smarts or his ruthlessness. It was his ability to identify the potential for a more structured, efficient form of criminal enterprise. He was a visionary, not simply a follower of the old ways. While the traditional mafia figures relied heavily on violence and intimidation, Luciano saw a different path, a way to turn criminal activity into a business. He was an opportunist, but not in the traditional sense. He didn't just seek power. He sought to control the systems of power, to weave them into a structure that would serve his long-term goals. He could see that the mafia, if managed like any other enterprise, could generate massive wealth and influence. His vision wasn't just about the underworld of New York, it was about dominating entire industries, controlling economies, and establishing his presence on a global scale. But as he began to lay the foundations for his empire, he would soon find that the real battle was not in the streets, but in the minds of men. While the gangs fought among themselves for dominance, Luciano would begin to build his alliances, slowly, carefully. He needed men who understood the world he was trying to create, Men who weren't just loyal to the cause but who could help him solidify his control over the underworld. This wasn't going to be a war won with guns alone. It would require strategy, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. Luciano would soon learn that power wasn't just about being feared, it was about being respected, even loved, by those closest to him. The men who would become his most trusted lieutenants were not just brutal enforcers or mindless followers. They were individuals with their own ambitions, desires, and flaws. Luciano knew that the key to keeping them in line wasn't just through fear, but through a complex web of mutual interest. The promise of wealth, power, and security, along with the unspoken loyalty that came with being a part of his empire, was the glue that held his organization together. This was how he would unite the fractured mafia world, and how he would begin to consolidate power over vast territories, carving out an empire of unimaginable scale. Yet, while Luciano's rise seemed unstoppable, it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. The very alliances he had carefully crafted began to fray, and rivals started to take notice of his meteoric rise. Power, as Luciano would soon learn, was fragile, always under threat from those closest to you. As he ascended to the top, the dangers of his world grew ever more intense, and the price of his ambition would soon become clear. He would face enemies not only from the rival gangs he had once fought but from those within his own circle. Men who would betray him in the very same way that Luciano himself had once betrayed others. And as the war for dominance continued, Luciano would find himself caught in a deadly game of loyalty, betrayal, and survival. But this, in many ways, was what defined Luciano's world. It was a world where power was the only currency that mattered, a world where survival meant constantly adapting, constantly outwitting those around you. For Luciano, the underworld wasn't just a place of criminal activity, it was a microcosm of the larger society, a brutal, unforgiving system where only the most cunning and ruthless could thrive. And even as he built his empire, he couldn't escape the inherent contradictions of that world. The very things that made him so successful, his ability to manipulate, to create alliances, and to destroy his enemies, would eventually come back to haunt him, leading to his eventual downfall. This is where the story truly begins, at the intersection of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. It's the moment when power, once in the grasp of one man, begins to slip away. As Luciano's empire grew, so did the forces working against him. And the question becomes, could he hold on to that power? Or would the very system he created ultimately destroy him? In this shadowy world, everything is connected. One decision, one alliance, one betrayal can shift the course of history. And it is this delicate balance that will define Luciano's story, a story of rise, fall, and the echoes of influence that continue to shape the world of organized crime to this day. Before the empire, before the towering figures and the legendary rise of men like Luciano, there was a world defined by chaos, uncertainty, and constant strife. The early days of organized crime in America were far from the polished, streamlined organizations we now recognize as mafia empires. Instead, they were a patchwork of disparate groups, each struggling for control, each fighting to carve out their piece of the lucrative underworld that flourished in the shadows of American society. The story of how Lucky Luciano's influence would ultimately shape this chaotic world begins in the depths of this disorder. At the start of the 20th century, New York City was a rapidly growing, throbbing metropolis that seemed to embody the contradictions of the American dream. It was a city built on the backs of immigrants, the Irish, Italians, Jews, Germans, and others, who flooded into the city seeking better lives, only to find themselves trapped in poverty and overcrowded tenements. With each passing year, the neighborhoods of Manhattan and Brooklyn became more densely packed, more fractured, and more volatile. These were people who had come to America with hopes of prosperity, only to face oppression, prejudice, and hardship. The American promise was nothing more than a cruel illusion for many, and in this environment of desperation, crime was not an anomaly but a survival mechanism. The criminal world in New York at this time was far less organized than the sleek, business-like structures that would come to dominate later. There was no cohesive network, no grand strategy, no coordinated effort to control anything. It was a world of fragmented gangs, each with its own turf, its own rules, and its own petty disputes. These gangs weren't part of a larger system. They were isolated entities, often driven by ethnic or neighborhood loyalties rather than any grand vision of criminal enterprise. Some gangs operated in the slums, others controlled docks or gambling dens, and still, others were involved in more violent enterprises. The fragmented nature of these groups meant that they were more prone to conflict, which often spilled out into the streets in bloody confrontations. In this world, the mafia was only one piece of the puzzle. For many, organized crime was not seen as a structured, monolithic force but as a loose collection of street-level operations. The first generations of mafia bosses, often referred to as the Old Guard, ruled their territories through brute force, intimidation, and simple loyalty to their families. These were men who had come to America from Sicily and Naples, bringing with them the traditions of the Italian underworld, the so-called Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing. But the world they encountered in New York was much harsher and far more complex than the rural, tightly knit villages they had left behind in Italy. In America, crime was not just a matter of family honor, it was also about survival, opportunity, and sheer grit. Here, a street gang could quickly grow into a force capable of challenging the established order, but only if it could adapt and evolve. The chaos of this era was not limited to the criminal world. It was also a reflection of the broader social and political landscape of America at the time. The early 1900s were marked by rapid industrialization, waves of immigration, labor unrest, and an increasing sense of disillusionment with the American dream. The government, struggling to keep pace with the swelling populations and increasing social unrest, turned a blind eye to many of the illegal activities that were rife in the immigrant communities. Prohibition, passed in 1919, exacerbated this climate. The U.S. government made alcohol illegal, and the result was an explosion of underground operations dedicated to smuggling, bootlegging, and distributing alcohol. Suddenly, every street corner became a potential battleground for control over the lucrative illegal trade, and the need for organization, unity, and strategic planning became glaringly apparent. This new world of illicit alcohol trade created unprecedented opportunities, but it also created fierce rivalries. Gangsters who once operated in isolation now had to face off against one another in order to control the most valuable commodity of the time. The days of operating with impunity, of being the unchallenged master of a neighborhood or a small district, were over. To survive, these gangs would need to come together in new ways. They would need to forge alliances, broker deals, and when necessary, break each other's necks in the silent wars that raged in the dark corners of the city. This was a world of survival of the fittest, where only the strongest, most cunning could rise above the rest. But even in this chaotic underworld, there were hints of something greater emerging. It was during this time that a young, ambitious man by the name of Salvatore Luciano first began to take notice of the shifting tides. Luciano, born in 1897 in Sicily, arrived in New York with his family at the age of 9, a boy thrust into the squalid poverty of the Lower East Side. Like many immigrants, Luciano's family hoped for a better future, but they were met with the harsh realities of life in America. In the maze of tenements and back alleys, Luciano's early experiences were marked by poverty and hardship. But it was precisely in this environment, with its code of survival and power, that Luciano would begin to understand the forces that would ultimately shape his future. While many young men in his neighborhood were drawn into petty crimes and small-time hustles, Luciano began to see something bigger. A system of control and manipulation that operated on a scale much larger than anything his peers could imagine. He saw the possibility of not just surviving in the criminal world, but of dominating it. Luciano's genius wasn't just his willingness to use violence or his skill in the streets. It was his ability to understand human nature, his ability to manipulate and organize people in ways that made them loyal to him. Even in this environment of chaos, he began to see the patterns that others missed, the connections between rival gangs, the possibilities for collaboration, and, of course, the immense potential for profit. But Luciano was not yet the master of the underworld. He was simply another young man with a vision, trying to make his mark in a world full of ruthless men. At first, his rise seemed improbable. He was neither the largest nor the most violent figure in the criminal landscape, but he had something the others lacked: a plan. He began to make moves behind the scenes, slowly positioning himself among the players who would help him rise. He formed alliances with powerful figures in the Italian-American crime syndicates, but he also recognized that the future of organized crime would not be about ethnic loyalty alone. It would require cooperation across different immigrant groups, bringing together the Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs that had long fought one another. As the power struggles continued and new players entered the scene, Luciano's vision began to take shape. The fragmented, disorganized world of New York's underworld would eventually coalesce into something greater, and it was Luciano who would lead the charge. But before that could happen, he needed to learn the full scale of the chaos around him. The rivalries and betrayals that marked the early years of his career would eventually give way to a brutal new order, one in which Luciano would control not just territories or neighborhoods but entire industries. The world before him was one of constant flux, of shifting allegiances and sudden, violent confrontations. But within that disorder, Luciano found the key to his future. In the end, the world before Luciano's rise was a world defined by the struggle for power in its most chaotic, primal form. It was a world where men like Luciano could not just survive but thrive, using intelligence and ruthlessness to rise above the fray. And it was in this environment, more than anywhere else, that Luciano would begin to hone the skills and strategies that would later shape his criminal empire. The chaos of the world before him was not something he sought to destroy, but something he would learn to manipulate and control. What was once a disorganized, fractured underworld would soon become the foundation for a powerful, unified criminal empire, and Luciano would be at the helm, guiding it with the cold, calculating precision of a man who understood the true cost of power. Salvatore Lucky Luciano's early life was one of struggle, hardship, and a relentless drive to overcome the circumstances that bound him. Born in 1897 in the heart of Sicily, Luciano was just 9 years old when he and his family emigrated to the United States, settling in New York City, the very epicenter of the American immigrant experience. The Lower East Side, where the Lucianos took residence, was a crowded, gritty area, teeming with families who had come from every corner of the globe, all hoping to build better lives. But instead of opportunity, the Lucianos encountered the harsh reality of life in the tenements, where poverty, overcrowding, and a lack of social mobility shaped the future of countless immigrants like them. The American dream, for many, was a distant illusion. For Luciano, this environment wasn't just a challenge, it was a breeding ground for ambition. The city streets were alive with a certain type of energy, the kind that comes with raw potential but also with unrelenting danger. Here, power wasn't given, it had to be taken. The reality of Luciano's childhood shaped him deeply. The world he grew up in was a harsh, unforgiving one where survival meant constantly navigating a landscape of gang rivalries, ethnic tensions, and economic disparity. In a neighborhood where many were struggling to get by, those who could command power or control resources quickly became influential figures. It was here, in the heart of the Lower East Side, that Luciano learned the most important lesson of all. The only way to thrive was through power, and the best way to acquire power was through manipulation and control. Luciano's early encounters with crime were not so much a matter of choice as they were a necessity. To survive in a world defined by gang turf wars, low wages, and constant discrimination, young men like him were often drawn into petty crimes, theft, smuggling, and the kind of street-level hustling that became part of the fabric of immigrant life. For Luciano, the allure wasn't just the money but the idea of something greater. While other boys in his neighborhood might have been content with small-time schemes, Luciano had bigger dreams, even if he didn't yet know how to articulate them. He instinctively understood that power wasn't about fighting on the streets for scraps. It was about organizing those scraps into something much larger. He began to see criminal activity not as a series of isolated incidents, but as part of a broader structure, a system that could be controlled, leveraged, and most importantly, expanded. By the time Luciano was a teenager, he had already begun to make a name for himself in the criminal underworld. He was known for his ability to get things done, whether it was smuggling goods, running numbers, or facilitating illegal deals. But even more than that, Luciano had an uncanny knack for reading people. He was able to understand the motivations, desires, and weaknesses of those around him, a skill that would prove invaluable in the years to come. It wasn't just his ability to act decisively that set him apart, it was his ability to influence others, to make them feel as though they had something to gain by aligning themselves with him. It was here that Luciano's first real taste of power began to take shape. In his early days, Luciano ran with a variety of smaller gangs, each controlling a different aspect of the city's underworld. There were the Jewish gangsters, the Irish racketeers, and, of course, the Italian mafia. Each group had its own code, its own hierarchy, and its own turf. But what Luciano saw, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, was that these fragmented groups were inefficient and vulnerable. The constant infighting between ethnic gangs weakened the entire criminal network, and he understood that if he could bring these factions together, he would not only have control over a vast array of criminal activities, but he would also be able to exert influence over an entire city, and eventually, a country. At this stage, Luciano had begun to display the kind of leadership qualities that would later become his trademark. He was a master of building relationships, not just with gangsters but with politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement. He wasn't just interested in physical dominance. He understood that true power lay in control over systems and people. Unlike many of the more violent, impulsive mobsters of his time, Luciano thought strategically. He knew that in order to climb the ranks, he had to distance himself from the pure brutality of street crime and transform it into something more sophisticated. He began to focus on smuggling rings, gambling operations and, crucially, bootlegging. Prohibition, which started in 1920, would prove to be a turning point in Luciano's life. It created an entirely new market for illegal goods, especially alcohol, which had previously been regulated and taxed. Now, with alcohol made illegal across the country, a massive underground economy exploded. Gangsters like Luciano saw this as a golden opportunity to amass wealth, and they did so quickly, flooding the market with bootlegged liquor. This was where Luciano's genius truly began to shine. While others were still focused on small-time rackets, Luciano saw the vast potential in an industry that, by its very nature, required large-scale organization, intricate distribution networks, and the cooperation of multiple players. He wasn't content with running a single block or neighborhood. He wanted to dominate the entire East Coast. One of Luciano's first major moves was to align himself with the powerful boss of the Genovese crime family, Giuseppe "Joe" Masuria. Masuria was a dominant force in the Italian mafia, but he was also known for his stubborn, old-school approach to crime. He ruled through brute force and intimidation, preferring to settle disputes with violence rather than diplomacy. Luciano, however, understood that the future of organized crime wasn't about endless bloodshed. It was about control, strategy, and the careful management of resources. He knew that Masuria's approach would eventually lead to the family's downfall, and so, Luciano bided his time, earning Masuria's trust while secretly planning to usurp him. In the meantime, Luciano's power and influence grew. He made connections with other crime bosses, notably Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, two Jewish gangsters who shared his vision of a more organized, corporate-style underworld. Together, they began to formalize plans for a larger syndicate, one that could control not only the illegal activities of the city but also influence political and economic structures. Luciano understood that crime was just one part of the equation. To truly thrive, a crime syndicate needed connections to power on every level. He began to build relationships with influential politicians, corrupt law enforcement officials, and even labor unions. These alliances would prove crucial in the years to come, giving Luciano the leverage to expand his empire while keeping law enforcement at bay. Through his strategic partnerships and his growing network, Luciano's reach extended far beyond the Lower East Side. He became a key player in the larger underworld of New York, and eventually his influence began to spread to other major cities across the country. But his biggest move, the one that would ultimately cement his place as one of the most powerful men in America, was the war he would wage against Masuria and the old guard of the Mafia. It was a battle that would reshape the entire structure of organized crime in the United States. Luciano's coup against Masuria was as much about psychology as it was about violence. He knew that to seize control he had to outsmart his mentor, not just overpower him. It was a move that would require the careful orchestration of several key events, including alliances with rival factions and a strategic killing that would send shockwaves through the underworld. In 1931, after years of carefully plotting his rise, Luciano finally struck. Masuria was murdered, and with his death, Luciano took control of the Genovese crime family and established a new era of organized crime in America. But while Luciano's rise was marked by strategic brilliance, it also revealed the darker sides of his character. Beneath the smooth exterior, Luciano was ruthless. He was willing to betray those who trusted him, manipulate those who believed in him, and discard anyone who got in his way. His ambition was limitless, and he understood that in the world he had chosen, there were no loyalties, only power. And to achieve power he would need to make sacrifices no matter the cost. This was the world that Luciano was shaping, a world of alliances, betrayals, and ruthless ambition. The young immigrant from the Lower East Side was no longer just a street thug. He had become the architect of a criminal empire. His rise was not simply the result of brute strength or luck but the manifestation of a carefully crafted plan, built on intellect, manipulation, and an unwavering desire for control. But as Luciano's empire expanded, so too did the dangers. Power once attained was never secure. And Luciano would soon learn that the higher he climbed, the harder he would fall. As Luciano's empire began to solidify, it became increasingly clear that his approach to organized crime was far more sophisticated than anything seen before. What set him apart wasn't simply his ability to navigate the cutthroat world of mobsters and corrupt officials. It was his revolutionary understanding of how crime could be organized like a legitimate business. Luciano's vision was not of a disjointed collection of independent gangs fighting over scraps. but of a tightly knit, coordinated syndicate capable of controlling large-scale operations, with its fingers in every pie from gambling to labor unions to smuggling. What he was building was more than just a criminal organization. It was the foundation of a new order in the underworld, one that would endure far beyond the violent days of street-level crime. In many ways, Luciano's ambition mirrored that of corporate pioneers in the early 20th century, men who saw the world not in terms of turf and violence, but in terms of markets and profits. Just as an entrepreneur would develop a business plan to streamline production and maximize efficiency, Luciano saw the world of organized crime as one that could be organized for maximum efficiency and profit. He understood that in order to dominate not just a city, but an entire nation, his organization would need structure, leadership, and a clear division of labor. It was his strategic brilliance that allowed him to take full advantage of the opportunities presented by prohibition, and it was through this lens that Luciano began to shape his empire. The most significant move Luciano made was the consolidation of power, a process that started with his collaboration with other influential figures in the underworld. He recognized that to grow his influence he needed to forge alliances, not just with Italian mobsters, but with men from all ethnic backgrounds. This was not about ethnic loyalty, it was about control and access to valuable resources. He began to work with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, who shared his vision for a more organized, corporate-style crime syndicate. Lansky, with his financial acumen, would prove to be invaluable in managing the flow of money, while Siegel's connections and willingness to use violence made him an effective enforcer. Together, they began to create a more efficient system of operations. Luciano's power was no longer defined by the territory he controlled, but by the massive network of illegal businesses he was able to coordinate. This network included bootlegging, prostitution, gambling, and labor racketeering, all highly profitable industries that could be controlled and manipulated through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and strategic partnerships. Luciano's understanding of these industries was not merely transactional. He understood that they were part of a much larger system, one that required careful management and oversight. Every move he made, every decision he took, was based on the need to streamline operations and ensure that his criminal empire functioned as smoothly as a legitimate corporation. The key to Luciano's success lay in his ability to bring order to the chaos. Under his leadership, the mafia was no longer just a series of disconnected, violent gangs. It had become a finely tuned machine, a network of interconnected operations that stretched across the country and even into foreign territories. He understood that a criminal empire was much like any business. In order to thrive, it needed to be able to expand, adapt, and maintain control over its operations without being bogged down by petty conflicts or inefficiencies. One of the primary ways Luciano brought this order to the underworld was by establishing the concept of the Commission. This was a body of powerful crime bosses from different ethnic groups who would meet to discuss the business of crime, divide up territories, and settle disputes without the need for bloodshed. The Commission wasn't a new idea, but Luciano was the one who formalized it, turning it into a governing body that would oversee the major criminal activities in the United States. By creating this institution, Luciano effectively ended the era of constant gang warfare and replaced it with a more structured system of cooperation. The Commission was the ultimate expression of Luciano's vision, a controlled, methodical approach to crime, where power was not decided by violence alone but through negotiation and strategy. Under Luciano's guidance, the mafia's influence expanded far beyond traditional crime operations. He was one of the first to recognize the potential for corruption and manipulation within American politics, and he moved quickly to form strategic alliances with politicians and law enforcement officials. Through bribes and threats, he was able to secure protection for his operations, ensuring that law enforcement would turn a blind eye to many of his most lucrative enterprises. He also manipulated the labor movement to his advantage, gaining control over unions and using their influence to secure profitable deals with businessmen and corporations. Through these partnerships, Luciano ensured that his empire was not only untouchable but also insulated from the risk of legal prosecution. Luciano's network was not limited to New York or even the United States. His operations extended across the globe, from Cuba to Canada to the Caribbean, and he made strategic investments in international smuggling operations, creating a global criminal enterprise that was as sophisticated and far-reaching as any legitimate multinational corporation. This international scope allowed him to create a vast web of influence, further solidifying his position as the most powerful figure in American organized crime. What made Luciano's empire so effective was not just its ability to generate massive amounts of money, but the fact that it was built on a foundation of collaboration and coordination. Unlike his predecessors who had often ruled through violence and fear, Luciano recognized the importance of loyalty, mutual benefit and long-term planning. He knew that in order to succeed, he had to ensure that everyone in his network was invested in the success of the operation. He rewarded loyalty and punished betrayal, creating a system in which those who contributed to the empire's success were rewarded with power and wealth, while those who betrayed him or failed to meet expectations were swiftly dealt with. But Luciano's vision went beyond simply building a vast criminal empire. He saw himself not just as a gangster but as a businessman and a leader, someone who could control a vast network of industries and shape the future of organized crime in a way that no one else had before. He understood the value of branding and public image, and he worked to create a mythos around the mafia, making it not just a criminal syndicate but a symbol of power, respect, and success. He became a figure of legend, a man whose name was synonymous with the rise of organized crime in America. But behind the myth was a man who was always calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. One of Luciano's greatest innovations was his approach to maintaining order within his organization. He did not rely on a strict hierarchy in the traditional sense, but instead created a system of checks and balances, in which power was distributed across different factions, each of which had a vested interest in maintaining the stability of the empire. He understood that if too much power was concentrated in one person or one family, it could lead to infighting and eventual collapse. By distributing power more evenly, Luciano ensured that no one individual could rise up and challenge him, while also creating a sense of unity among the different factions of the mafia. In addition to his tactical brilliance, Luciano was also a master of psychological warfare. He understood that loyalty and fear were 2 sides of the same coin, and he used both to keep his empire in check. He was capable of cruelty when necessary, but he also understood the importance of rewarding loyalty, creating a sense of camaraderie among his men, and ensuring that those who followed him felt a deep sense of loyalty and indebtedness. His leadership was marked by a combination of respect and fear, which allowed him to maintain control over a vast network of individuals who, despite their ruthlessness, were ultimately motivated by the prospect of reward and security. As the head of his empire, Luciano faced constant challenges, both from external enemies and internal rivals. But through it all, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal: the creation of a criminal organization that was as powerful, profitable, and sophisticated as any legitimate business. His methods were cold, calculated, and at times brutal, but they were also effective. He had built an empire that was impervious to the forces that sought to tear it down. In doing so, he redefined what it meant to be a mob boss. He was no longer just a thug or a gangster. He was a visionary who had built a criminal dynasty that would stand the test of time. And in this way, Luciano's empire became a model for organized crime across the world, a shining example of what could be achieved through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and strategic vision. The mafia has always been a world of its own, governed by an unspoken set of rules that dictated how individuals within it behaved, and more importantly, how they survived. At the heart of this underworld code was the omerta, the sacred, unwavering law of silence and loyalty. This code became the bedrock of organized crime, a guiding principle that ensured the survival of the mafia and, paradoxically, its continued operation in plain sight. The mafia's code of conduct was not just about secrecy. It was about power, hierarchy, and the control of information, which were all essential to maintaining authority and discipline within such a volatile world. Omerta was not simply an informal guideline but a core tenet that all involved in the criminal underworld, particularly those under the banner of the Cosa Nostra, were expected to uphold. The code demanded silence in the face of law enforcement and a refusal to cooperate with authorities, no matter the cost. It was the ultimate form of loyalty, designed to protect the organization and its members from outside threats, particularly the prying eyes of law enforcement. To break this code was to invite betrayal, punishment, and, in the most extreme cases, death. This culture of silence meant that the mafia could operate under the radar, carrying out its operations without fear of informants or traitors exposing them to the authorities. It created an insular world where loyalty was paramount and any hint of disloyalty was seen as a threat to the entire structure. But loyalty within the mafia wasn't just about maintaining silence in the face of the law. It was also about maintaining a sense of unity and mutual benefit between the members of the organization. Luciano understood this more than most. He knew that in order to build a lasting empire, the members of his crime syndicate had to believe that loyalty wasn't just a one-way street. They had to believe that their loyalty to him would be reciprocated. This meant that trust, respect, and mutual gain were as important as fear and intimidation. Loyalty, in Luciano's view, was not simply about obedience. It was about creating a system in which every player stood to gain from their commitment to the group, while the repercussions for betrayal were severe enough to ensure that loyalty was never questioned. In this environment of strict codes and rules, Luciano's leadership style stood out as a mixture of wisdom, pragmatism, and an almost cold, calculating genius. He didn't demand loyalty through blind allegiance or brutality alone. Instead, he built relationships with his underlings based on the concept of a shared goal: wealth, power, and success. His men knew that as long as they were loyal to him, they would be well compensated and protected. There was a transactional quality to loyalty in Luciano's empire, but it wasn't just about the exchange of money or favors. It was also about creating an emotional bond, a sense that, no matter the hardship or risk, everyone was working toward the same end. This idea of loyalty was also reinforced by Luciano's own conduct. Unlike many of his predecessors in the mafia, who often ruled through fear and violence, Luciano knew that maintaining a balance of power meant he had to play both sides. He was not a man who sought to alienate his allies, nor did he thrive on making enemies. His was a world in which compromise and negotiation played as large a role as force and violence. In Luciano's eyes, loyalty wasn't just something you extracted through intimidation. It was something that could be built through thoughtful action and strategic decision-making. He rewarded loyalty not just with money but with influence and status within the organization. Those who demonstrated their allegiance to him were given power, making them integral parts of the operation. However, this sense of loyalty didn't apply to just anyone. It wasn't about loyalty to the family or the organization as a whole, at least not in the abstract sense. Luciano was the central figure in this web of loyalty, and he demanded absolute loyalty to himself and his vision. The structure of the mafia under Luciano was one of careful hierarchy, and while everyone in the organization was expected to follow the code of silence, it was Luciano's personal authority that gave this code weight. He didn't just expect loyalty, he enforced it through his actions, his network of allies, and his ability to predict the needs of those around him. One of the most striking aspects of Luciano's leadership was his understanding of human nature. He knew that to maintain loyalty he had to understand the desires, motivations, and weaknesses of those he worked with. He didn't see his men as mere pawns to be moved at will, but as integral components of a much larger system. By understanding what each individual wanted, whether it was wealth, power, respect, or something else entirely, Luciano was able to leverage those desires to his advantage. His empire was held together not just by fear, but by an intricate web of personal relationships, all built on mutual benefit. But it wasn't just the leadership within the mafia that was tied to loyalty. In a world of constant threats and rivalries, loyalty also extended to the relationships between different factions within the organization. Rival gangs, which had once fought bitterly for control of neighborhoods and territories, now had to work together under Luciano's new system. The establishment of the commission was a direct response to the fractured nature of organized crime, and it was a testament to Luciano's genius in creating a structure that demanded cooperation. The commission was designed to bring together the major crime families under one roof, creating an organized, unified front against common enemies. Luciano's recognition of the value in such alliances spoke volumes about his understanding of the mafia's evolution. Instead of fighting each other, Luciano's model made it clear that cooperation between factions was a far more effective means of controlling the criminal underworld. Omerta, however, wasn't just about loyalty to the mafia and its leaders. It was also about self-preservation. For many, the unbreakable bond of loyalty was not just a matter of respect but of survival. The mafia was an unforgiving world, and anyone who broke the code could expect swift and brutal consequences. Breaking Omerta wasn't just a violation of trust. It was an existential threat to the entire organization. A rat, someone who cooperated with law enforcement or betrayed their brothers, was considered the ultimate traitor. Someone who not only endangered the lives of those around him but also jeopardized the system that had given them power. Omerta ensured that no matter the circumstances, members of the mafia would never cooperate with authorities. For them, snitching was the ultimate sin, and it came with the most severe punishment: death. This concept of loyalty and silence also had a psychological aspect. The mafia thrived on a sense of brotherhood and belonging. Those who joined the organization, especially immigrants trying to carve out a place in the harsh world of New York streets, found in the mafia not just a way to make money but a family. The mafia, under Luciano, provided something that many of its members had lacked in their lives: purpose, power, and protection. In a world that was often hostile and dismissive, the mafia offered a sense of community, a place where loyalty could be rewarded and where one's status was defined not by birth or social class, but by what they brought to the table. But this loyalty was also a double-edged sword. While it created a sense of unity and security within the organization, it also perpetuated the insular nature of the mafia. The sense of loyalty that ran so deep within the organization was, in many ways, its greatest strength. But it was also its greatest weakness. When you are bound by such rigid codes of conduct, there is little room for dissent or disobedience. For those who broke the code, there was no forgiveness, no second chances. And for those who upheld it, the price of betrayal was often a life lived in constant fear. Loyalty, in the world of the mafia, was both a shield and a sword. It protected the organization from external threats but also made it an environment where distrust and paranoia thrived. The Code of Omerta was more than just a set of rules, it was a way of life that defined the very structure of organized crime. It was a culture of silence, loyalty, and unity, and under Luciano's leadership, it became the foundation upon which his criminal empire was built. Through Omerta, Luciano was able to control not just the actions of his underlings but also their minds, shaping them into a tightly knit force that would stop at nothing to achieve its goals. The code may have been brutal, but it worked. It created a world in which loyalty was not just a virtue but a lifeline, a bond that ensured the survival of the mafia for generations to come. In the shadowed corners of Luciano's empire, the reality of organized crime wasn't limited to the bloodshed of street battles or the whispered deals in dark alleyways. The true brilliance of his rise lay in his ability to take criminal endeavors and turn them into well-oiled, profitable enterprises. Luciano understood early on that the days of random street crime and territorial disputes were over. If the mafia was to thrive and grow beyond the confines of neighborhoods and families, it needed to evolve into something more, something far more powerful, sustainable, and profitable. Crime was no longer just an act of defiance against the law. It was a business, and like any business, it needed structure, efficiency, and organization to be successful. Luciano, ever the visionary, transformed illicit activities into vast industries, all of which were governed by the same principles that guide legitimate enterprises. One of Luciano's earliest and most important moves in this direction was his understanding of the potential wealth hidden in illegal alcohol. Prohibition, which began in 1920, presented the perfect opportunity for organized crime to capitalize on an otherwise flourishing but restricted industry. Alcohol, once legally produced and consumed, was now a commodity coveted by the public but outlawed by the government. As liquor disappeared from legal markets, it quickly began to make its way into the hands of gangsters, smugglers, and bootleggers, all of whom sought to supply a thirsty nation. Luciano saw that the prohibition was more than just a hurdle, it was a gold mine. Luciano didn't simply engage in bootlegging, he organized it. While small-time crooks continued to smuggle and distribute alcohol in various forms, Luciano realized that the key to greater profits was scale. He consolidated smuggling routes, streamlined operations, and negotiated deals that crossed state lines and even international borders. What made Luciano's approach different was that he wasn't just taking advantage of the black market for alcohol, he was creating an infrastructure around it. Instead of relying on small-time operations or haphazard street-level dealings, he orchestrated a massive supply chain, a network of distilleries, warehouses, transport routes, and sales outlets that ensured steady, reliable access to the illicit substance. This level of organization required coordination, something that Luciano was particularly skilled at. He created a hierarchy within the mafia, with each member or faction of the organization holding a specific role in the bootlegging process. The people who worked for him knew their positions, from those responsible for procuring and transporting alcohol to those responsible for its distribution and protection. Luciano's ability to delegate and manage operations allowed him to expand his reach without overextending his influence. His smuggling operations were no longer a matter of risk and chance but had become systematic, predictable, and highly profitable. He understood that the key to growth wasn't simply gaining more territory, it was about controlling every aspect of the illegal business, making it as efficient and profitable as any legitimate company. While bootlegging was perhaps Luciano's most lucrative venture, it wasn't the only illegal activity that he recognized as ripe for organizational innovation. Gambling, in all its various forms, had long been a staple of organized crime, but Luciano understood that it could be more than just a sporadic operation. He began to standardize gambling activities, turning illegal casinos, betting rings, and other gambling operations into steady sources of income that rivaled legitimate casinos in their profitability. As with bootlegging, the key was scale. Rather than allowing individual gamblers to run their own small operations, Luciano set up networks that could handle the volume of bets coming from all over the city and beyond. He created organized pools for betting on everything from horse racing to boxing matches, ensuring that his empire could rake in money from every angle. Gambling wasn't simply about placing bets, it was about creating an environment where gamblers knew they could come, place their wagers and trust that the game would be fair, or at least predictable. Luciano's ability to manage this network, ensuring that no one group or faction would take too much control, was key to its success. What made Luciano's gambling empire so effective was his approach to conflict resolution. He wasn't a leader who encouraged chaos, rather he encouraged cooperation between rival factions, understanding that in order for his operations to thrive, everyone had to get a piece of the pie. His belief in shared profits and fairness within the organization, albeit in the most ruthless way, was the glue that held his criminal empire together. As Luciano's power grew, so did his influence in the world of unions and labor. Unlike many of the mobsters of the time who viewed unions as simple tools for extortion and exploitation, Luciano understood the true potential of controlling labor organizations. The mafia's connection with the labor movement was a mutually beneficial one. The unions provided workers for various industries, while the mafia provided protection and influence. But Luciano didn't just settle for mere extortion from union leaders. He infiltrated the very heart of the labor movement, placing his own men in key positions to control the flow of work, control contracts and manipulate wages and working conditions for their benefit. Luciano's grasp on labor unions was a critical part of his power. By controlling union leaders and securing their loyalty, he was able to manipulate industries such as construction, docks and transport. This gave him a stranglehold on industries that were essential to the functioning of the economy, making it impossible for legitimate businesses to operate without at least passing through the mafia's influence. With such control, Luciano could demand payment for everything from labor strikes to protection from sabotage. He used the unions not just to generate profits, but to gain leverage over industries and politicians, securing the continued growth of his criminal operations. But it wasn't just about controlling businesses or industries. Luciano's reach extended deep into the world of international smuggling. While the U.S. government was focused on enforcing prohibition and cracking down on the domestic bootlegging industry, Luciano recognized the need to expand his operations overseas. He established lucrative smuggling routes from places like the Caribbean, Canada, and even Italy, ensuring that his operations had access to a steady stream of products that could be sold illegally in the U.S. Not just alcohol, but other contraband like drugs, weapons, and even stolen goods found their way into Luciano's criminal enterprise. By diversifying his smuggling network, Luciano ensured that his empire was resilient to any one market being disrupted. This global reach gave Luciano an unprecedented level of power and influence. He wasn't just a local mob boss, but a kingpin with international reach. His empire spanned from the streets of New York to the ports of Cuba, from the docks of the Mediterranean to the seedy underworld of South America. This vast network not only made Luciano incredibly wealthy but also insulated him from any single government crackdown. If one smuggling route was blocked or one product became less profitable, he simply shifted to another, ensuring that his empire could continue to thrive without interruption. Luciano's ability to adapt to changing circumstances and capitalize on new opportunities made him a master of the criminal underworld. One of the most remarkable aspects of Luciano's criminal empire was its ability to transcend the limitations of traditional criminal enterprises. Instead of focusing solely on street-level crime, he built an empire that was structured, diversified, and adaptive. He took advantage of economic, social, and political changes, from the rise of prohibition to the expansion of labor unions to the emergence of international smuggling routes, and used these changes to his advantage. His understanding of business principles, combined with his ruthless ambition, enabled him to create a criminal organization that wasn't just a fleeting moment in time, but a long-lasting, adaptable structure that could withstand external pressures. At the heart of this business model was the recognition that crime, like any other enterprise, could be organized for long-term success. Luciano didn't just want to make money, he wanted to make money on his own terms. He was a master of leveraging resources, whether it was his network of loyal followers or his ability to manipulate the law, labor unions, or even politicians. Each part of his empire, from bootlegging to gambling to smuggling, was carefully managed and strategically integrated into the broader structure of the mafia. In doing so, Luciano didn't just become a powerful figure in the criminal world. He became the architect of a new type of organized crime, one that was as efficient, expansive and profitable as any legitimate corporation. Through his keen business sense, Luciano not only reshaped the mafia but also created a model for organized crime that would outlast his lifetime. His criminal empire was not simply a collection of illicit activities, it was a business empire in its own right, built on a foundation of organization, efficiency, and control. By making crime a business, Luciano ensured that the mafia would continue to thrive for generations, becoming a part of the fabric of American society and leaving an indelible mark on the history of organized crime. Luciano's ascent to power wasn't merely the product of a sharp mind and impeccable strategy, it was also deeply intertwined with his ability to navigate the complex web of alliances, betrayals and rivalries that defined the world of organized crime. At the heart of his success was his understanding of the precarious balance between cooperation and conflict, and how to use both to his advantage. In a world where trust was scarce and every move was fraught with danger, Luciano mastered the art of managing relationships with both friends and enemies. His ability to turn potential threats into allies and rivalries into opportunities marked him as a mastermind of the underworld, a man who knew how to orchestrate power plays that reshaped the entire criminal landscape. One of the most pivotal moments in Luciano's rise was his ability to form and maintain powerful alliances, particularly with influential figures within and outside the Italian mafia. In the early stages of his career, Luciano didn't possess the raw power or the reputation to rule the mafia outright. He was an ambitious young man, eager to make his mark in a world dominated by established crime families. But unlike other mobsters who often sought to dominate through violence and brute force, Luciano understood the power of strategic partnerships. He saw early on that in order to succeed in the fractured, competitive world of organized crime, he needed to unite various factions that were divided by ethnic lines, territorial disputes and personal vendettas. At the time, the Italian mafia in America was still operating under a system of fragmented family-based control, with each boss overseeing their own territories and operations. While the mafia had a reputation for being a powerful and secretive organization, it was also plagued by infighting and constant rivalries. The lack of unity among the various crime families made them vulnerable to law enforcement crackdowns and rival criminal organizations. Luciano, however, saw this division as an opportunity to unify the mafia under one banner and consolidate power in a way that had never been done before. He began his journey by aligning himself with key figures who shared his vision of a more organized, cohesive criminal empire. One of the first alliances Luciano forged was with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster and mastermind of the gambling industry. Lansky, with his sharp business acumen and connections in the world of finance, was the perfect partner for Luciano. Together, they would form a partnership that would prove essential to Luciano's rise to power. Lansky helped Luciano organize his gambling operations, turning them into a profitable, streamlined enterprise. The two men also worked together to establish smuggling routes and connections to international markets, expanding the reach of Luciano's operations beyond New York and into other major cities and even foreign territories. At the same time, Luciano also began building relationships with other influential figures in the mafia, such as the powerful Genovese crime family boss, Giuseppe "Joe" Masuria. Masuria was a dominant figure in the Italian mafia, a man who ruled with an iron fist and used his authority to maintain control over a vast network of criminals. Luciano initially served under Masuria, but as he rose through the ranks, he began to see that Masuria's heavy-handed leadership style was limiting the potential for growth and unity within the mafia. Luciano, with his more pragmatic approach, recognized that the future of organized crime lay in cooperation and efficiency, not constant violence and power struggles. As Luciano's influence within the Genovese family grew, so did his ambition. He began to quietly build his own faction within the organization, recruiting loyal followers who shared his vision of a more organized and profitable mafia. At the same time, he began to secretly undermine Masuria's authority, sowing the seeds of betrayal that would ultimately lead to a dramatic turning point in Luciano's rise. Luciano knew that in order to become the undisputed leader of the mafia, he would have to rid himself of Masuria, the man who had been both a mentor and a rival. This moment of betrayal would become one of the most significant events in the history of organized crime, marking the beginning of Luciano's domination over the mafia. The actual betrayal came in 1931, when Luciano orchestrated the murder of Joe Masuria. The killing was not a spur-of-the-moment decision but the culmination of years of careful planning and maneuvering. Luciano knew that he couldn't simply challenge Masuria outright, as doing so would have led to a full-blown war within the mafia, one that could have easily torn the organization apart. Instead, Luciano worked behind the scenes to gather the support of key figures within the mafia, including rival bosses and even some members of Masuria's own crew. Luciano's ability to play both sides, offering protection and promises of power to those who switched allegiance, was a masterstroke of manipulation. The murder of Masuria was executed with cold precision, and it sent shockwaves through the mafia world. Masuria's death was not just the end of an era but the beginning of a new order, an order where Luciano stood as the central figure, the man who had united the various factions of the mafia under his control. But this victory was not without consequences. The power vacuum left by Masuria's death sparked a brief but violent war between Luciano's faction and that of Salvatore Maranzano, another powerful mafia boss who sought to fill the void left by Masuria. The war between the two factions was brutal, and it tested Luciano's resolve and leadership skills. However, Luciano, ever the strategist, saw the war with Maranzano as an opportunity to further solidify his control. He knew that in order to secure his position as the undisputed leader of the mafia, he would have to eliminate Maranzano and his supporters. Again, Luciano didn't rely solely on force. Instead, he employed his talent for negotiation and manipulation to win over key members of Maranzano's faction. With the help of his allies, including Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Luciano orchestrated the murder of Maranzano, effectively ending the war and securing his place at the top of the mafia. The victory over Maranzano marked the final step in Luciano's rise to power, but it also signaled the beginning of a new era for organized crime. With the removal of his rivals, Luciano was able to implement his vision of a more structured, corporate-style mafia. One of the first things he did as the undisputed boss of the mafia was to establish the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the major crime families. The Commission was designed to bring order and stability to the mafia, ensuring that power was distributed more evenly and that disputes between families could be settled without resorting to violence. The Commission was a revolutionary idea that transformed the mafia from a collection of disparate, often warring factions into a more unified, efficient organization. By consolidating power and creating the Commission, Luciano was able to eliminate the chaos and instability that had plagued the mafia for so long. The Commission allowed for greater cooperation and coordination between the various families, ensuring that resources were shared and conflicts were resolved peacefully. This system not only improved the efficiency of the mafia but also reduced the risk of infighting and external interference. With the Commission in place, Luciano had effectively created a system of governance that ensured the mafia could operate without the constant threat of internal conflict. Luciano's leadership wasn't just about securing power, it was about maintaining that power through careful management and diplomacy. He understood that to maintain control over the mafia, he needed to ensure that the leaders of the various crime families felt that they had a stake in the organization. This wasn't just a matter of sharing profits. It was about creating a sense of loyalty and cooperation that would bind the families together. Luciano's ability to foster this sense of unity, while still maintaining his own supremacy, was key to his long-term success. He knew that in the world of organized crime, power was fluid and constantly shifting, so he made sure that his position was always secured through a combination of diplomacy, manipulation, and, when necessary, violence. Luciano's success was also due in part to his ability to navigate the ever-present threat of law enforcement. As the head of the mafia, he was constantly under the scrutiny of the police, the FBI, and other government agencies. But instead of relying solely on brute force to maintain his control, Luciano used his political connections and his influence over corrupt officials to protect his operations. He cultivated relationships with politicians, law enforcement officers, and businessmen, ensuring that his empire remained insulated from the prying eyes of the authorities. Luciano's ability to use the system to his advantage, rather than constantly fighting against it, was one of the reasons why he was able to maintain his position as the leader of the mafia for so long. The alliances that Luciano forged, the betrayals he orchestrated, and the wars he won all played a critical role in his rise to power. But they also shaped the very nature of the mafia itself. Under Luciano's leadership, the mafia became an empire, a vast, organized criminal syndicate that stretched across the United States and even beyond its borders. It was an empire built on alliances, power struggles, and most importantly, the ability to turn rivals into allies and conflicts into opportunities. This ability to navigate the complex, often treacherous world of organized crime and to emerge as the undisputed leader of the mafia was what truly set Luciano apart from his contemporaries. As Luciano's empire grew, so did the number of challenges he faced. The mafia's very existence relied on a delicate balance between power, influence, and secrecy, and it wasn't long before the forces that had once aided his rise began to close in on him. The war between rival factions, though now over, had left behind a trail of bodies, betrayals, and simmering resentments. The law, once a mere annoyance, had become a real threat. Even within the ranks of the mafia, Luciano faced growing dissent and suspicion from those who didn't fully embrace his vision of a more organized and businesslike crime syndicate. Despite all this, Luciano, ever the strategist, recognized that this period of growing pressure and conflict could be navigated. The real battle for his survival, however, would not just be against his enemies on the streets or even within his own ranks. It would be against the institutions of law and order that were starting to bear down on his operations with a renewed vigor. From the very beginning, Luciano understood that to secure lasting power, he had to remain elusive, always operating just beneath the surface of the law. He knew that every criminal empire, no matter how powerful, was always at risk of being brought down by legal institutions. The FBI, local police, and prosecutors were beginning to sharpen their focus on organized crime, and Luciano's name was starting to rise to the top of their lists. But Luciano, with his keen ability to predict and manipulate situations, understood that direct confrontation with law enforcement would be disastrous. Instead of fighting head-on, Luciano devised a strategy that would allow him to navigate these dangers while still keeping his empire intact. For Luciano, the first major test came with the increasing pressure on his illegal operations during the late 1920s and early 1930s. With the Prohibition era in full swing, the government was cracking down on bootlegging and alcohol-related crimes, trying to undermine the growing influence of organized crime in America. As more and more law enforcement resources were funneled into fighting prohibition-related crime, the mafia was forced to become more secretive, operating in the shadows with even greater efficiency. Luciano, though, saw this pressure not as a threat to his operations but as an opportunity to strengthen his position. The government's focus on prohibition opened the door for Luciano to expand into other areas of criminal activity. While bootlegging remained a cornerstone of his empire, he diversified his criminal operations to ensure that, no matter how the law tightened its grip on one area, he could still count on the profits from others. This shift toward diversification wasn't just about surviving the increased scrutiny, it was about positioning himself and his organization to thrive in the face of ever-growing challenges. Luciano, always looking for ways to stay one step ahead, expanded into gambling, labor racketeering, narcotics trafficking, and even political corruption, ensuring that his empire was insulated from any single failure or government crackdown. The escalation of law enforcement attention, however, did not go unnoticed by Luciano's rivals. While Luciano had managed to eliminate some of the most powerful bosses through his strategic alliances and the murders of Masuria and Maranzano, new threats were constantly emerging. The tension between the government's increasing pressure and the growing ambitions of rival mobsters became the backdrop for one of Luciano's most significant challenges. During the early 1930s, various factions of the mafia, particularly those loyal to the old guard and the more traditional, violent methods of crime, began to question Luciano's leadership. They saw him as too much of a businessman, someone who prioritized organization and profits over the raw violence that had historically defined mafia dominance. These tensions began to boil over, with a growing faction of discontented mafia figures seeking to challenge Luciano's vision of the future. These rival factions, while not directly challenging Luciano's rule through open warfare, began to conspire against him. They had the power, resources, and experience to strike at the heart of his criminal empire. To make matters worse, the increasing legal pressures created an environment in which loyalty could be bought, and betrayal became a tool of survival. If an underling felt the heat of an investigation, if they feared the looming threat of prison or worse, they might see it as an opportunity to switch allegiances. In this atmosphere of distrust, Luciano had to double down on his leadership, ensuring that every one of his loyalists was firmly tethered to him and his vision. Luciano's ability to maintain control over his vast empire amidst these internal and external pressures was a testament to his skill at managing loyalty, fear, and greed. But just as he had once orchestrated the elimination of Masuria and Maranzano, Luciano would face an even greater threat, one that he could not easily eliminate with force or manipulation alone. This threat was the combined weight of the law, and in many ways, it became the hidden war that Luciano could not fight in the traditional sense. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, had begun to focus its energies on infiltrating organized crime, especially the most powerful figures in the mafia. The government's primary aim was to weaken the mafia's financial muscle by targeting its illicit operations and its leadership. One of the most significant developments during this period was the rise of government tactics that focused not only on capturing criminals in the act but also on breaking down their organizations from within. The government began to focus on building long-term cases against key figures in the mafia, going beyond street-level crime to focus on financial networks, rackets, and the ways in which criminal organizations operated like businesses. Luciano, always a step ahead, knew that these tactics represented a threat far more insidious than any street-level rival or betrayal within his ranks. He had long relied on the silence of his underlings and the protection of corrupt officials to keep his empire running smoothly, but these new tactics presented a danger he couldn't easily counteract. In 1936, Luciano was finally caught in the government's web. After years of investigations and mounting pressure, the authorities, aided by the growing sophistication of investigative techniques and wiretapping, were able to bring a case against Luciano. In a calculated move that shocked even some of his closest allies, he was arrested on charges of running a massive prostitution ring and other related crimes. The case against him was carefully constructed, with prosecutors using evidence gathered over the course of years. The trial became a spectacle, as the government sought not just to take down Luciano but to send a message to the entire underworld. The mafia, which had long operated with impunity, was now facing an unprecedented level of scrutiny, and the government was determined to break its back. Luciano, ever the tactician, did not panic. He knew that the government's case, though strong, was not yet airtight. He began to turn to his loyal allies, trying to leverage his influence over them to ensure that no one would turn on him and offer testimony in exchange for leniency. His control over the internal affairs of the mafia remained strong, but he was dealing with a force far more persistent than any rival gang or rogue faction within his ranks. This was the power of the state, and even Luciano's remarkable resilience could not shield him from its reach. Despite his efforts to stay in control, the trial and conviction were inevitable. In 1936, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for his role in the prostitution ring. It was a crushing blow not just to Luciano personally, but to the empire he had worked so hard to build. His arrest was a signal that the mafia was no longer untouchable, that even its most powerful figures could be brought down by the force of the law. For Luciano, the fall from grace was swift and severe. Yet even as the authorities took away his freedom, Luciano's story was far from over. His time in prison would mark a new chapter in his career, one in which he would prove once again that the structures he had built could not easily be dismantled. While the government believed they had broken his hold over the mafia, Luciano, though behind bars, would continue to exert an extraordinary amount of influence. His story was far from finished. Even in captivity, his strategic mind and unparalleled ability to manage criminal networks would ensure that he remained a key figure in the mafia for years to come. But the government's grip on him was tightening, and it was clear that this new war, the war against the state, would be one he could not fight from the shadows. The final chapter in his rise and fall was about to unfold, and Luciano's empire was facing its most significant test yet. Luciano's fall began not with the hand of a rival or an internal betrayal, but with the weight of the law finally catching up to him. His world, which had once seemed invincible, now trembled under the pressure of an exhaustive government investigation. For years, Luciano had been untouchable. His smarts, his alliances, his networks had allowed him to operate with near impunity. But the arrest in 1936 marked the moment that the unthinkable happened. The legal system began to systematically dismantle the empire he had built from the ground up. The investigation was one of the most comprehensive and well-coordinated attempts ever made to infiltrate the mafia. Prosecutors and law enforcement agents, now more sophisticated and determined than ever, managed to piece together enough evidence to pin Luciano to a vast web of criminal activities, from illegal prostitution rings to the corruption of politicians and law enforcement officials. The charges were numerous and the case was undeniable. Luciano's fall was swift and unforgiving. In a world where power had once been secured through force and bloodshed, the law now posed a different kind of threat, one that could not be fought with bullets or brute force. The trial, which gripped the public's attention, became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a spectacle. The media frenzy surrounding Luciano's arrest only magnified the consequences. The once untouchable boss of the mafia was now a public figure caught in a trap he could not escape. What had been a world of shadows and whispers was now laid bare for the public to see. The courtroom drama, fueled by the government's determination to make an example of Luciano, was a stark reminder that even the most powerful men could be brought to heel. When the verdict came in, Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentence was a crushing blow, not only because of the sheer length of time but because it symbolized the end of an era for the mafia. Luciano had been the heart of the organization, the man who had built it into an empire. His presence was felt everywhere, and now, as he was carted off to prison, the underworld seemed to lose its most important figure. To the outside world, this was the moment when the mafia had been struck a fatal blow. The government, it seemed, had finally won. The defeat of Luciano wasn't just a personal loss, it was a blow to the entire system that he had helped create. Yet, even in prison, Luciano's influence was far from extinguished. This was, perhaps, the most surprising aspect of his downfall. While many assumed that his incarceration would mark the end of his reign, Luciano proved that even behind bars, he remained a force to be reckoned with. His reputation and strategic genius continued to resonate in the mafia world. Luciano didn't simply fade away into obscurity. He continued to wield power from within the prison walls, using his connections and resources to maintain control over his criminal empire. Even though physically incarcerated, Luciano's mind remained free, and it was that mind, sharp and calculating, that allowed him to continue pulling the strings of the mafia from his cell. He maintained contact with his loyalists on the outside, issuing orders and making decisions that affected the direction of the entire organization. In prison, Luciano's ability to manipulate his environment became clear once again.
His most significant asset was not just his ability to command loyalty from those around him, but his understanding of how to navigate the bureaucracy and power structures that govern the prison system. He cultivated relationships with fellow prisoners, prison guards, and even officials. He understood that to survive and maintain his power, he had to operate within the constraints of the system. He did not expect to escape the confines of the prison, but he knew that if he could secure favorable treatment and build alliances within the institution, he could continue to influence events on the outside. Luciano was a master at adapting to changing circumstances, and in prison, that adaptability became a cornerstone of his survival. Despite his legal troubles, Luciano never fully abandoned his criminal activities. His conviction and prison sentence did not dampen his drive for power, wealth, and control. Instead, he found new ways to exploit the situation for his benefit. The mafia world, after all, was a business, and Luciano knew that the most important thing was ensuring its continued operation. He knew that if he could retain his influence, the mafia would continue to thrive. The underworld didn't stop just because its most powerful figure was behind bars. In fact, Luciano's imprisonment created a vacuum of power that some of his rivals sought to fill. But Luciano wasn't content to let anyone else take his place. From his prison cell, he maneuvered, always a step ahead, keeping the mafia's operations running smoothly even as he faced the harsh realities of his new life. One of the key moments during this period was Luciano's eventual transfer to a maximum security facility. The authorities, eager to break his will and erase his influence, placed him in a remote prison with stringent security measures. However, rather than breaking him, this transfer only seemed to solidify Luciano's reputation as a man who could not be defeated. It was during this time that Luciano's relationships with his allies, especially those in the mafia, became even more critical. He continued to coordinate his operations from inside, issuing orders to his loyal followers and ensuring that his empire didn't crumble in his absence. It wasn't long before Luciano was able to leverage his position and secure certain privileges in prison. He was allowed access to communication with his outside contacts, which only cemented his hold over his organization. In fact, some reports even suggest that Luciano continued to receive payments from his criminal enterprises while in prison. Whether through intermediaries or directly from his associates on the outside, Luciano's ability to stay connected to the wealth and power of his empire was unparalleled. While other mafia leaders might have been forgotten in prison, Luciano's influence only grew stronger. The fact that he was still able to command the loyalty of his men from behind bars only further solidified his status as a living legend, a figure whose power transcended even the physical boundaries of his imprisonment. However, despite his ongoing control over his criminal operations, the years in prison were not without personal challenges for Luciano. The loss of his freedom, the constant threats from both within and outside the prison system, and the mounting isolation began to take their toll. In the early years of his imprisonment, Luciano had maintained a certain level of optimism. He knew that his empire was still intact, and he still had a strong base of loyal followers. But as time wore on, the harsh reality of prison life began to set in. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, understood that his situation would not last forever. Even if he could maintain control over the mafia, his own physical and mental health was deteriorating. The years of stress, danger, and confinement were beginning to wear him down, and Luciano, who had once been a master of survival, began to feel the weight of his own mortality. Eventually, the government, recognizing Luciano's ongoing influence, made a deal that would bring an end to his imprisonment. In exchange for his cooperation in helping to stop the flow of Italian immigrants into the U.S. and his supposed influence over organized crime in Italy, Luciano was offered the possibility of deportation. This was a rare and somewhat controversial move, sending one of the most powerful criminals in history back to his homeland, where his influence might still be felt. For Luciano, the deal represented both an escape and a surrender. He agreed to the terms and, in 1946, was deported to Italy, marking the end of his time behind bars. But even in exile, Luciano's influence did not wane.